Every Sunday on the mountain of chapel service, we do this, and when we get to the second star, when I look down from lofty mountain grandeur, I stop them and I have them all look around and see what God has done. We're running about 35 people every Sunday up there on skis and snowboards. Yeah, pretty neat. All right, so, oh Lord my God, when I in awesome wonder consider all the worlds thy hands have made, I see the stars, I hear the rolling thunder, thy power to love the universe display. Then sings my soul, my Savior God to thee. How great thou art! Stand or sit, how great thou art! Daniel chapter 5. And you see on the map, or the picture I drew so beautifully, spent hours working on this. Well, maybe not. The Euphrates River coming in, the city of Babylon, 80 foot wide, 200 feet high wall around Babylon, 13 miles around. The river comes under the wall, bringing them water. They had great storage already saved up, and these two gates were supposed to be locked. And we'll find out what happens. Okay, chapter 5, ready to go. Belshazzar, remember now, he is actually the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar has died after converting, after becoming a follower of the true God in chapter 4. He has now passed away, and 4 different kings take his place, but only for a short period of time. But 20 years have gone by, and now his grandson, Belshazzar, takes over as the king. This is about 538 BC. He has a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. Now, why would he have a great feast in the middle of this? Well, he was so confident that they were going to outlast the siege that he really said, hey, we're going to have a morale building party. We're going to bring everybody in the whole community there was having a big party. But he had 1,000 of his leaders right there with him. He tasted the wine. He gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar, his father, his grandfather really, had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. All right, now, so he's drunk. All right, when it says he tasted his wine, went back and checked that out, he'd really become under the influence of the wine. So it says, hey, we brought back all that gold and silver stuff from Jerusalem, from the temple. Now remember, these vessels had been consecrated to the Lord. They had been put aside for holy use in the sacrifices in the temple. But he says, I'll bring them in. We're going to have a party. We're going to drink out of them. That was not unusual for conquering kings to take things from the other nations and things from their gods to show that their God was bigger than these other nations' gods. And you'll hear them all through the Old Testament boasting, well, look what our God did. Which God can stand against us? You remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego heard that from Nebuchadnezzar. What God can save you from my wrath? And remember Goliath, when he was faced with David, he says, wow, your God's not big as my God. We can, all these things. When you start offending God. But he was offending God. And then what did they do, though? His wives and his concubines. What was a concubine? Anybody remember from their other studies somewhere? A concubine was kind of a secondary wife, okay? They had no rights, but they were for sexual pleasure. They were to produce a male heir. So in case your wife couldn't produce a male heir to take over, to keep your line going, these concubines. Now, the Jews had them for a while, and they were given more rights in the Jewish religion, but still, they weren't considered wives. They were secondary. They were to increase the family size of the king, to increase his power. So they were just concubines might drink from them. And then they brought the gold and silver vessels which had been taken out of the temple, the house of God, which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wife and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and what?
Praised the God.
Praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So they're praising these false gods using God's holy, sanctified vessels. So it's really, they're just being very sacrilegious. They're blaspheming God. Verse 5, suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. Verse 6 ties back into this Isaiah passage you read a minute ago. Then the king's face grew pale, his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, his knees began knocking together. All this is prophesied 150 years earlier in Isaiah chapter 21. So all this is happening, and you can get more and more into that the more you study it. He was terrified. I had a guy skiing with me this week. We took him up the lift. We began to come down. It's the first time I had skied with him. We were doing what we call a split. We had a group lesson of about 7 or 8 people. We had 2 instructors, and we were going to break them into stronger and weaker, break them into 2 smaller groups. Well, this one man, I went over to help him a little bit. This businessman, he looked at me and says, "I am terrified." He shouldn't have been where he was. He kind of, how you do, males tend to overestimate their ability. Ladies tend to underestimate their ability on the skis and such. Being terrified is awful. And this man was terrified. He'd been boastful. He'd been, "I've got this, I've got that." And now all of a sudden, his knees are shaking. He's having all kinds of issues. All right, so verse 7. The king called aloud to bring in the conjurers. Remember those guys? The Chaldeans, the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, "Any man who can read this inscription, explain its interpretation to me, shall be clothed with purple." And one of my guys in the Bible study at Crested Butte this week, one of our ski instructors said, that purple was a really royal robe because it was so hard to get and so expensive. But he said something about it being made out of snails' shells and all that. I don't know all of that, but it was very high honor to have the purple robe. He said that he'll have the purple robe, a necklace of gold around his neck, and authority as the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. Now, who are the first 2 rulers in the kingdom? Belshazzar, his father, who was out in the field with the armies, and they said, "You would be number 3 in control here." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. God blinded these guys. They couldn't do it. Do you remember when this happened earlier with Nebuchadnezzar? When he had a dream, you remember? And he brought in all the diviners and the astrologers and the sorcerers, all these people, and they said, he said, "Tell me the dream and its interpretation." Remember, they said, we can't. But then Daniel was given that gift back in chapter 1, given the gift to understand dreams and interpret. All right, and remember, Daniel was always humble about it. He said, "I didn't come up with this on my own. God gave me this ability." And that's the way we should do with the abilities we have. Okay, so we go a little further here. Then he was, verse 9, King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. Imagine that scene. Here's this big party, and all of a sudden, everybody's going, "Wow, that handwriting on the wall, that hand, that nobody understands it." Okay, so what the queen mother really, so it would be either Nebuchadnezzar's widow or maybe the king's wife. She enters the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles, and she spoke and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods." And some of the Hebrew texts there, or in this case Chaldean text, will say the spirit of the holy God. Okay, so she recognized, and Nebuchadnezzar had recognized when he gave himself to the Lord, that there's a very special place here and that there's only one God. And she said, he has illumination, insight, wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, your grandfather, the king appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. Why? This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. So she comes in, and here's this drunken party that's all of a sudden gone sour, and she says, hey, hold it. There is someone who can explain all of this to you. All right, so in verse 13, then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah? Now, what does he mean there? What happened? Why was Daniel there in Babylon? What's that?
He was a captive.
Yeah, he was one of those exiles captured in Israel, in Judah, taken to Babylon and trained to be a leader in Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. Are you that one whom my father the king brought from Judah? Now, I have heard about you. You have the spirit of the holy gods, or other reading of there is the Spirit of God, is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now, verse 15, the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me, that they might read this inscription and make the interpretation known to me. But they could not declare the interpretation of the message. God's speaking, but they don't hear. They don't get it. All right, so what happened? I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you're able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler of the kingdom. So he's saying, now, here, Nebuchadnezzar did this too. Do you remember? He said, you'll get great riches and honor. You'll just tell me what my dream was and what the interpretation was. But what does Daniel say here? Daniel now is about almost 90 years old. Okay? He started out as a teenager, maybe 15, maybe 18 years old. Now 70 years that Jeremiah had prophesied are about to come to an end. Remember, Jeremiah said for 70 years you're going to be in exile. Now, after 70 years, this is all coming to a head. All right? So he says, I'm going to give you all of this, but what does he say? Verse 17, and Daniel answered and said before the king, keep your gifts, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make known the interpretation to him. I thought this was interesting. Chuck Smith, who I listen to when I'm driving to work in the mornings, pastor, founded the Calvary Chapels. Chuck Smith made a comment. He said, if you prophesy for a price, there's a problem. You know, if you're going to serve God, if you get paid enough, there's a problem. We started a group in Lake City back in the 70s, called me one day and said, would you and Melva come down, or would you come down? Melva had the kids, busy with the kids, but will you come down and teach a Bible study for us? And I said, I'll come one time. And I drove down, and anyway, all of that became Grace Fellowship Church down there with Lynn Lampert. But before they had a pastor, a lady there who ran the place that we were meeting, she said, I asked my pastor I know in Montrose to come down, if he would come and be a pastor once a week with us too, and help you out, teach and everything. And she said, it really hurt me. I said, well, what? He said he would come if we would guarantee this much money and cover this much, you know, and pay this much and all that. And she said, you've never asked us for anything. And I said, well, a servant of God is not a hireling. Remember, Jesus talked about people that get hired to serve, they run when the things get tough, or someone who stays as a shepherd. And this is what Daniel is doing. He says, I'm not here for the money, guys. Okay. Yeah?
What happened at the gas station when
when I left, okay, the rest of that story? All right. I went down, I taught the Bible study. There was about 8 or 10 people. They said, this is great. Will you come back? But on my way down, the Lord had told me, don't go back unless there's a man willing to take responsibility locally. And so I told him that. I said, I'd love to come back. We were going to Crested Butte every week, doing services at Blue Mesa, doing services at Tall Texas, but I'll come back if there's a man in this group willing to take responsibility. Not one man would take that role. So I said, okay, sorry, can't come back. Went to fill up my car, a little VW Bug at the Town Square gas station and cabins there in Lake City. Man comes out, starts talking to me. He says, are you Rick? I said, yeah. How'd the Bible study go? I had to be working, but I want to come. I said, well, it went pretty well. Are you coming back? I said, no. He said, why not? I told him. This man looked at me and he just kept washing the wind. Remember when they used to wash windshields, and pump your gas? And he stopped, he said, I'll be that man. And that's how that started. That's how that whole ministry down there grew. And when he was about to go into heaven, his wife called me from Texas, called Melvin and I got on the phone, and Melvin and I sang for him over the phone some of the songs that we used to sing in the Lake City Fellowship with him. And he passed into glory, and she still supports us and prays for us, and we talk to her. And so it's a great story. All right, thank you for asking. Okay, down in verse 7 or 18 now. Now Daniel, remember, he's almost 90 years old, but he's going to land on the line here. Courageous, yeah. He makes a statement later on, Tim, where he says, those who know their God will display strength and take action. And that verse has stuck with me for many years. If you know your God, you will display strength and take action. You won't be hiding in the back here.
Old Belshazzar could have lopped his head off.
Yeah, he could have.
I don't like your message, bud.
Right. And there are people that don't like to hear the truth.
Yeah.
And I like what Daniel said, if you don't want to hear it in the movie, if you don't want to hear the truth, don't ask me the question. All right, so verse 18. O King, the Most High God granted sovereignty, grandeur, glory, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar, your grandfather. Because of the grandeur which he bestowed on him, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language feared and trembled before him. Whomever he wished, he killed. And whomever he wished, he spared alive. And whomever he wished, he elevated. And whomever he wished, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit became so proud that he behaved arrogantly, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his glory was taken away from him. Like we studied last week. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of beasts. And his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and he sets it over it whomever he wishes. There's a couple things in there, is that, guys, don't you see Belshazzar? Don't you remember that story? You've heard that 100 times of how your grandfather ended up eating grass and living for 7 years out in the woods and acting like an animal before God restored him, before he humbled himself. Don't you remember that? Now, there was an interesting line that I had not noticed in all the times I read this. But God gave him the dew of heaven. And as I was reading and studying that, someone shared in one of the commentaries, that was God's grace. How many times could Nebuchadnezzar have been killed? How many times could he have died of what he was eating or in animals? Well, at the ski area this week, we've had foxes run onto the trail, got porcupines on the tree. But these were lions and tigers and bears, oh my. They could have got him. And yet God gave him the dew of heaven. God protected him. God refreshed him, took him alive during all that time. But, okay, so now, verse 22, Yet you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. There's a different judgment for those who know the gospel and those who don't know the gospel. Remember, Jesus said it would have been better for these cities, Sodom and Gomorrah even, than it is for you, because you've seen me. You know what I'm saying. You know the gospel, and yet you reject it. Belshazzar knew that God was God. He knew there was only one true God. He knew what happens when you exalt yourself against God, and yet he did not humble himself. Verse 23, But you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. You brought the vessels of his house before you. You and your nobles, your wives, your concubines have been drinking wine from them instead of what they were created for. You have praised the gods of what? Silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, stone, which do not see, hear, or understand. But they're the God in whose hand are your very life, breath, and all your ways you have not glorified. Now, Melvin and I had the privilege of leading worship on a four-masted sailing ship from Athens to Istanbul. And we got to go through these different ports, Corinth and Patmos, and these different places we went where the Apostle Paul had preached. We saw in the museums these horrible idols, but they were coated with gold and silver, and they had all this fancy, and if you look today at Hindu temples and all, so much expensive, and even in some churches, all this idols made up with all this gold and silver and everything, and yet what? They do not see, they do not hear, they do not understand. And that made me think, how many of my idols can I set up? Skiing, forest service, firefighting, money, fame, whatever it is, these idols, and you can dress them up, you can make them look really fancy, but they can't see, they can't hear, they can't understand, they can't help in times of need. But the God who can, he says, you have not exalted, you blasphemed him. You've not glorified him. So then verse 24, the hand was sent from him, from God, and the inscription was written out, and here's what it means. Mene, tekel upharsin. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Now, why do you think it was repeated twice? Emphasis. Yeah, that's what pretty much every scholar I read, emphasis. Yeah, it's like several times in Scripture, what did Jesus say? Hear ye, verily, verily. Come on, pay attention here. This is important stuff, he says. Mene, your kingdom has been put to an end. But notice the tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. So not only is your kingdom coming to an end, you have been judged by God personally. And God deals with each one of us personally. There are no grandchildren in God's family. Each of us is accountable to God. Now that's good, and that's also very sobering. I can't say, well, I talk to people sometimes and say, well, you know what? Oh, you're a preacher. My daddy was a missionary. Yeah, but what about you? My grandfather, we come from a lot. No, that's wonderful. Praise God for that heritage. But what about you? God holds each of us personally accountable. You have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Perez, your kingdom has been divided and given over to the Medes and the Persians. Well, they were outside the wall. We'll get to that in a second. Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as a third ruler in the kingdom. How long did that last? Look, the same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was slain. So Darius the Mede received the kingdom about the age of 62. So here's what happened. And this is in part of the video, and I may have missed part of that. I did miss part of it. Getting everything ready. Here they are, impregnable. You can't get in. So what did he do? Let me have a marker here. Yeah. Cyrus, the king, who was in charge, really, Darius was under him, his father-in-law was under him, said, wow, one night I got this dream, and if I divert this river away, this gets dry, my soldiers can walk in on the riverbed, and they got to the gates, and apparently the guards were all drunk. They weren't locked. The gates weren't locked. And so and they conquered the city that night. Just like had been for Babylon. Remember Isaiah 21? Has fallen. Babylon has fallen. Wow. So let's take a look at our notes here real quick. I know some of you have already filled them in. That's good. And I'm not even accusing you, Ryan, of writing notes back and forth. I know you're doing your homework. By the way, we had our first official session yesterday afternoon of our 5-minute theologian class. It's not too late to get in. Grab us. It'll go for a long time. It's a good study. You study ahead of time and you fill in blanks and then we discuss them. But Ryan and Rachel were there along with Holly, another lady in the community, and who else? Loretta. Yes, Loretta was there. And so we're getting that started. All right, so here we go. Daniel, the feast. Belshazzar is overly confident of outlasting the Medes and the Persians and throws a great feast. Yeah, F-E-A-S-T, feast. Under the influence of the wine, he calls for the holy golden vessels used in the worship of God in the temple of Jerusalem, and he fills them with wine and praises his gods. And what were those gods? The gods of gold and silver and all of these things. A hand suddenly appears on the wall and starts writing in a strange language. Belshazzar is terrified, back to Isaiah 21, terrified, and offers whoever can interpret and explain what it means great rewards, including third in command of the kingdom after his father and himself. None of his wise men can read or explain the writing. God doesn't allow them. Some scholars feel it was in Aramaic, but that was not an unusual language. That could have been, but we don't know. But God didn't let these guys get it because he wanted to say something special. He calls for Daniel and offers him riches and rewards if he can interpret and explain it. Daniel tells him to keep his rewards or give them to someone else. Daniel then rebukes Belshazzar for not learning from Nebuchadnezzar's experiences. The Most High God appointed Nebuchadnezzar to be king. When Nebuchadnezzar became proud, God turned him into a beast, but gave him grace, the dew of heaven, and restored him when he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over all mankind and sets over it whomever he wishes. Still, Belshazzar, even though he knew this, exalted himself against the Lord and worshiped gods that cannot see, hear, or understand, instead of the true God who gives life. Let me just say something real quick about that story locally here. If some of you remember, there was a statue supposedly of Mary north of town. I was told this, and I can't document it. I was told that a man fell off the roof, was dying, and he was crawling to that statue when he died. And that hit me. Did that statue help him? Could that statue help him? Could a wooden idol, could something that's man-made save your life? And that's no, only God. The interpretation. Words that God gave Daniel insight but hid from the wise men. Mene, God has numbered your kingdom and put an end to it. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balance and found lacking. Upharshin is handed over to the Medes and the Persians. Belshazzar gave Daniel the rewards and appointed him third ruler in the kingdom. But that same night, Darius, the head of the Medes, diverted the Euphrates River, entered the city gates by the way of the riverbed, and conquered Babylon. He had Belshazzar killed. Okay. The applications. Alcohol or drugs do not bring out the best in anyone. Especially leaders. Most of us are familiar with Proverbs 31 about the part about the wonderful wife. Melville reads it to me at night when I'm going to bed. How wonderful. No. But most of us miss the first part of Proverbs 31. And in there, this woman is saying, it's not for kings, O Lemuel, to drink wine, lest they forget. You know, we're not, don't be in the New Testament, elders, deacons, we're not supposed to be wine bibbers. They're not supposed to be under the influence, and drugs the same way. Okay. God takes blasphemy very seriously. Treat him and his works with honor and respect. False gods can't see, hear, or understand. God's patience does eventually run out. Belshazzar knew what happened, but ignored it. Let's read this verse together, underneath there. A man who hardens his head after much reproof will suddenly be broken beyond remedy. If you look back at Pharaoh, when he was confronted by Moses, let my people go, Pharaoh kept hardening his heart. And finally, Pharaoh dies in the Red Sea. Okay. The answer is to humble ourselves before God and others, honor him in our actions, and exalt him. Learn from others and our own mistakes. Now, we looked at that last week a little bit with Nebuchadnezzar. God gave him a second chance. Learn from our mistakes. When I screw up, I need to learn from that and say, okay, Lord, I get it. Because if you harden your heart, if you keep saying no to God, you're bringing God's judgment upon yourself.
Belshazzar didn't get a second chance.
You know, he did, because he'd heard all about Nebuchadnezzar. He knew what had happened. He had that opportunity. But finally, got to that point. We should always be ready to share God's word with others. Read it, pray over it, and share it. You know, Daniel was ready. Daniel knew the prophecies. Daniel had read Jeremiah. Daniel had read Isaiah. Daniel knew what was coming. If we kept on through the rest of Daniel, we would see he refers back to different scriptures. God has no grandchildren, only children. Even though Nebuchadnezzar repented and became a follower of the true God, his grandson didn't. Okay, questions, comments? What do you see in